At Dad's 70th birthday party, he and my brother Mike delivered a speech that labeled me as the family failure who had never lived up to expectations. The moment I walked into the backyard, I could feel something was off. The decorations were perfect, those elegant silver and gold balloons floating everywhere, the fancy catering setup, even a professional photographer capturing every moment. Mom had gone all out for Dad's 70th and the whole extended family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years, even some family friends from way back. Everyone was dressed up, champagne glasses in hand, that kind of picture-perfect family gathering you see in movies. I'd spent weeks preparing for this day, not just emotionally but practically too. I'd driven 12 hours from across the state, taken time off work I couldn't really afford to lose, and even bought a new dress because I wanted to look put together for once. The navy blue one with the little flowers that Mom always said brought out my eyes. I'd practiced conversations in my head during the long drive, imagining how I'd explain my latest project, how I'd deflect the usual questions about my unconventional choices. My stomach was doing those familiar flip-flops as I made my way through the crowd. You know that feeling when you're walking into a room full of people who've already formed opinions about you before you even open your mouth? That was me every single family gathering for the past 15 years. I grabbed a glass of wine from the nearest server and tried to blend into the background near the rose bushes Mom had spent all summer nurturing. The conversations around me were exactly what I'd expected. Career updates, mortgage rates, whose kid got into which college, vacation plans to Europe. The kind of safe, successful adult topics that made me feel like I was still stuck in some awkward teenage phase while everyone else had figured out how to be proper grown-ups. I smiled and nodded when people asked how I was doing, giving vague answers about staying busy and keeping well. About an hour into the party, Dad stood up near the head table and started tapping his champagne glass with a fork. The crowd gradually quieted down, everyone turning toward him with those expectant smiles people get when they know a speech is coming. I positioned myself near the back, close to the garden gate in case I needed a quick escape route. Years of family gatherings had taught me to always have an exit strategy. Dad looked distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, the one Mom had insisted he wear even though he'd complained about it being too formal. His hair had gone completely silver now, but he still had the commanding presence that made people naturally listen when he spoke. He waited until he had everyone's complete attention before beginning. The speech started normally enough. Thanks for coming, how much the family meant to him, gratitude for reaching this milestone. Standard birthday speech material that had people smiling and nodding along. Then he gestured for my brother to join him and something in my chest tightened. Mike walked up with the serious expression I couldn't quite read, straightening his tie like he was preparing for something important. They stood there together, father and son, looking so similar with their broad shoulders and confident postures. Mike had always been the golden child, the one who'd followed the expected path, made the smart choices, lived up to every expectation our parents had ever set. Standing next to Dad, he looked like the perfect successor, the son any father would be proud to claim. What happened next still feels surreal, even now. Dad cleared his throat and announced that he wanted to talk about his children, about the different paths we'd all taken in life. My heart started racing because I knew where this was heading. In a family of achievers, I'd always been the outlier, the one whose choices didn't make sense to anyone else. He started with my older sister, praising her medical career, her beautiful family, her community involvement. Then he moved on to my younger brother, highlighting his business success, his leadership qualities, his responsible approach to life. The crowd was eating it up, beaming at these stories of accomplished children making their parents proud. Then he got to me. The shift in tone was so subtle at first that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But as he continued talking, it became unmistakably clear that this wasn't going to be the same kind of glowing tribute. He talked about my unconventional choices, my tendency to take risks that didn't pan out, my pattern of starting projects and then abandoning them for something new. Mike jumped in, adding details that made my face burn with embarrassment. They talked about my failed attempt at art school, how I dropped out after 2 years because I couldn't handle the structure. They mentioned the small business I'd started and closed within 18 months, how I'd lost money I couldn't afford to lose. They brought up my series of different jobs, my inability to settle down in one place, my habit of chasing ideas that seemed impractical to everyone else. The worst part wasn't even what they were saying, it was watching the faces in the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable, staring down at their drinks or suddenly finding the decorations fascinating. Others had that barely concealed look of pity mixed with superiority, like they were thinking how glad they were not to be in my shoes. A few relatives were actually nodding along as if they'd been waiting years for someone to finally say what everyone was thinking. I wanted to disappear into the ground. The wine glass in my hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and I was gripping it so tight I was surprised it didn't shatter. My face was burning hot, and I could feel tears starting to build up behind my eyes. This was supposed to be a celebration, a happy family moment, and instead I was being systematically torn apart in front of everyone I'd grown up with. They kept going, painting a picture of me as the family disappointment, the one who'd never quite figured out how to be a functioning adult. They talked about my tendency to be impulsive, my inability to follow through on commitments, my habit of making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Every criticism felt like a knife twist, especially because some of it was true. The photographer was still taking pictures, capturing my humiliation for posterity. I could imagine these photos showing up in family albums years from now, documenting the moment when I was officially labeled the black sheep in front of everyone who mattered. My hands were shaking, and I was seriously considering just walking out the garden gate and never coming back. But then something strange happened. Dad's expression started to change, and Mike was trying not to smile. The energy in the yard shifted in a way I couldn't quite understand. Dad looked directly at me for the first time during the entire speech, and there was something in his eyes that didn't match the harsh words he'd been saying. He talked about how my so-called failures had actually been something else entirely. How my willingness to take creative risks, even when they didn't work out, showed a kind of innovative thinking that was rare. How my tendency to question conventional approaches and try different solutions was actually a strength, not a weakness. How my unconventional path had given me perspectives and experiences that my more traditional siblings didn't have. The crowd was looking confused now, trying to follow this sudden shift in narrative. I was equally bewildered, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate setup for an even bigger humiliation. But Dad kept talking, and slowly, incredibly, it started to make sense. He explained that all my apparent failures had actually been preparation for something bigger. That my willingness to experiment, to fail, to get back up and try something different had convinced him that I was the one with the vision and resilience needed to take over the family business. Not my successful, conventional siblings who'd always played it safe, but me, the one who'd been willing to risk everything on ideas that might not work. The silence in the backyard was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as everyone processed what they'd just heard. My brother was grinning now, clearly in on whatever this elaborate plan had been. Dad was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pride mixed with apology mixed with something that looked almost like respect. He announced that he was officially retiring and turning over control of the company to me. Not just a job offer or a partnership, full control, with the expectation that I'd bring my unconventional thinking and creative risk-taking to help the business evolve and grow. He said that my siblings had their own successful paths, but the business needed someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo and try new approaches. I honestly don't remember much of what happened immediately after that announcement. There was applause, but it sounded muffled and distant. People were coming up to congratulate me, but their faces looked blurry and their words didn't quite register. I felt like I was underwater, trying to process this complete reversal of everything I'd thought was happening. Mike came over and explained that they'd been planning this for months. Dad had been watching my various projects and experiments, not with disappointment like I'd always assumed, but with growing recognition that I had something the business needed. The harsh speech had been his idea of reverse psychology, a way to make the final announcement more dramatic and meaningful. I wanted to be angry about the emotional manipulation, about being put through that humiliation in front of everyone. But mostly I just felt stunned, like I'd been living in one reality and suddenly discovered it was completely different from what I'd believed. All those years of feeling like the family disappointment, of thinking my choices were viewed as failures, and it turned out Dad had been seeing something else entirely. Update 1. The days after the party were a complete whirlwind. I kept expecting to wake up and discover the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate dream, but then my phone would ring with another call about business transition details, and I'd realize it was all actually happening. Dad wanted to start the handover process immediately, which meant I had to drive back home, quit my current job, pack up my life, and move back to my hometown within a month. It sounds crazy when I put it like that, but after years of feeling directionless, having a clear path forward felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The hardest part was telling my current boss. I'd been working at a small marketing firm, nothing glamorous but steady income, and my supervisor had actually been pretty supportive of my creative ideas. Explaining that I was leaving to take over a family business made me sound like some kind of privileged person who'd been coasting until Daddy handed me a company, which couldn't have been further from the truth. My coworkers threw me a going-away happy hour that turned into one of those unexpectedly emotional nights. People I'd worked with for 2 years were suddenly sharing stories about projects we'd collaborated on, ideas I'd contributed that had made a difference. It was like seeing myself through other people's eyes and realizing that maybe my contributions had been more valuable than I'd recognized. Moving back to my childhood hometown after being away for so long was its own kind of culture shock. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but also more detailed somehow. I noticed things I'd never paid attention to as a kid, the way the morning light hit the downtown buildings, how the seasonal changes affected the landscape around the business district. The family company turned out to be much more complex than I'd realized from the outside. Dad had built something substantial over the decades with multiple revenue streams and a surprisingly diverse client base. But he was right about it needing fresh thinking. Some of the processes hadn't been updated in years and there were opportunities for growth that nobody had been pursuing. My first week was mostly shadowing Dad and trying to understand how everything worked. The employees were polite but clearly skeptical about this sudden change in leadership. I could practically see the questions in their eyes. Was I qualified for this, or was this just nepotism disguised as succession planning? The turning point came during my second week when we lost a potential client because our proposal process was so outdated and inflexible. Instead of panicking, I suggested we completely redesign how we approached new business, incorporating some of the creative strategies I'd learned from my various failed ventures. Dad gave me permission to try it my way with the next opportunity. 3 weeks later, we landed the biggest new client the company had seen in 5 years. It wasn't just luck, all those projects that had seemed like failures suddenly made sense as learning experiences. The art school dropout had taught me about visual communication and creative problem solving. The failed small business had shown me what not to do, but also given me insights into client relations and project management. Even the series of different jobs had exposed me to various industries and approaches I could now adapt and apply. But the real surprise came when I started digging deeper into the company's history and discovered something Dad had never mentioned. About 15 years ago, he tried to expand into a completely different market segment. The venture had failed spectacularly, losing a significant amount of money and nearly putting the whole business at risk. When I asked him about it, his face got this expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of embarrassment and old pain. He told me that experience had taught him to be more conservative, more careful about taking risks. He'd spent the years since then building stability and avoiding anything that felt too experimental or uncertain. But watching me take risks and recover from failures had reminded him of his younger self, the version of him that had been willing to bet everything on untested ideas. He realized that his own fear of failure had been holding the business back, keeping it safe but also keeping it from reaching its real potential. That conversation changed everything between us. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like he actually understood me, not just as his disappointing daughter who couldn't get her act together, but as someone whose approach to life might actually have value. We started having real conversations about business strategy, about creative risk-taking, about the balance between stability and innovation. The family dynamics shifted too. My siblings were surprisingly supportive once they got over the initial shock. My sister admitted she'd always been a little envious of my willingness to try new things, even when they didn't work out. My younger brother confessed that he'd sometimes felt trapped by everyone's expectations of him to always make the safe, smart choice. Mike, who'd been part of the whole elaborate setup, turned out to be my biggest advocate. He'd been watching Dad worry about the business's future for months, knowing that neither of our more conventional siblings had the interest or the skills needed to take it in new directions. He'd been the one to suggest the reverse psychology approach, thinking it would make the announcement more memorable and meaningful. 3 months in, I was starting to feel like maybe I actually belonged in this role. The company was adapting to my leadership style, employees were bringing me ideas they'd never felt comfortable sharing before, and we were pursuing opportunities that would have been impossible under the old, more conservative approach. Update 2. 6 months into running the company, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my father and our family history. I was going through old financial records, trying to understand some long-term contracts, when I found a folder buried in the back of Dad's filing cabinet. Inside were detailed notes about each of his children, tracking our personalities, strengths, and career developments over years. But these weren't just casual observations, they were systematic evaluations, like he'd been conducting some kind of long-term assessment of our potential. The notes about me were the most extensive, going back to my teenage years. He documented every risk I'd taken, every failure I'd experienced, every time I'd gotten back up and tried something different. But instead of the disappointment I'd always assumed he felt, the notes showed genuine fascination with my resilience and creative problem-solving abilities. More shocking was what I found next, evidence that several of my so-called failures hadn't been as random as I'd thought. That art school I dropped out of? Dad had quietly spoken to one of the instructors about my work, trying to understand whether my unconventional approach showed real talent or just stubbornness. The small business that had failed? He'd been discreetly monitoring its progress and had actually identified several strategies that could have saved it but had held back because he wanted to see how I'd handle the challenge on my own. Even more disturbing was a series of notes about my siblings. Dad had concluded early on that while they were successful and reliable, they lacked the innovative thinking and risk tolerance needed to evolve the business for the future. He'd been planning to pass leadership to me for over 3 years, but had been waiting for the right moment and the right approach. I confronted him about the folder, feeling manipulated and confused about what was real and what had been orchestrated. Dad looked genuinely surprised that I'd found his notes, but not particularly sorry about keeping them. He explained that as a business owner, he'd learned to evaluate people systematically, and that included his own children when it came to succession planning. What bothered me most was the possibility that he'd been pulling strings behind the scenes, that my journey hadn't been as independent as I'd believed. Had I really overcome those failures through my own strength and creativity, or had he been subtly intervening to ensure I learned the right lessons? Dad insisted that while he'd been observing and evaluating, he'd never directly interfered with my experiences. The failures were real, the struggles were genuine, and the recovery had been entirely my own work. He'd simply been patient enough to see the long-term pattern while I was focused on the immediate challenges. But the conversation revealed something else that changed my understanding of our family completely. Dad told me that his own father had done something similar with him, systematically testing his abilities and character before eventually bringing him into what would become our family business. It was a multi-generational pattern of unconventional succession planning that I'd never suspected. This revelation sent me into a kind of identity crisis. Was I really the independent risk-taker I thought I was, or just the latest generation following a predetermined script? Had my rebellious choices actually been rebellious, or had they been unconsciously guided by subtle family expectations? The uncertainty affected my work performance. I started second-guessing decisions that had been feeling natural and confident. Employees noticed the change in my leadership style, and some of the momentum we'd built started to slow down. I was so focused on questioning the authenticity of my own abilities that I stopped trusting my instincts. Mike noticed my struggles and sat me down for a conversation that helped put things in perspective. He pointed out that regardless of Dad's observations and planning, I was the one who had actually lived through every challenge, made every difficult decision, and found ways to recover from every setback. The experiences had been real, the growth had been genuine, and the skills I developed were authentically mine. He also reminded me that Dad's systematic approach didn't diminish my accomplishments, it just meant he'd been paying attention instead of dismissing my choices as failures. Most parents of unsuccessful children don't spend years documenting their potential, they give up and focus their attention elsewhere. The turning point came when I realized that I could choose how to interpret this new information. I could either let it undermine my confidence and make me question everything about myself, or I could see it as confirmation that my unconventional path had been valuable all along. Dad's notes weren't evidence of manipulation, they were evidence that someone had been believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Once I accepted that perspective, I felt more grounded in my role than ever before. The combination of my hard-earned experience and Dad's long-term confidence created a foundation that felt both solid and flexible. I started making bolder decisions, pushing the company into new territories that excited both me and our employees. We launched 3 major new initiatives that fall, each one building on lessons I'd learned from my various failed projects. The art school experience informed a creative marketing campaign that got us noticed in trade publications. The small business failure had taught me about customer service issues that we were able to solve for our clients. Even my series of different jobs provided insights into industries and processes that gave us competitive advantages. By the end of my first year, the company's revenue had increased by 30% and we'd established partnerships that positioned us for long-term growth. More importantly, I'd found a way to channel my tendency toward creative risk-taking into something sustainable and valuable. Final update. 2 years later, I'm writing this from my office in the building where I used to feel like an outsider at family gatherings. The view from my window overlooks the same backyard where Dad and Mike delivered that speech that changed everything, and I can see Mom's rose bushes blooming again. The business has transformed in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. We've expanded into markets that didn't exist when Dad was running things, and our employee satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in company history. More importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts while also building the kind of systematic thinking that sustainable success requires. The family dynamics have settled into something healthier and more honest than they'd ever been before. Dad and I have a working relationship built on mutual respect rather than unfulfilled expectations. He still offers advice when I ask for it, but he's genuinely retired now, spending his time traveling with Mom and pursuing hobbies he'd put off for decades. My siblings and I have found a new equilibrium too. Instead of the old pattern where we competed for parental approval through achievements, we've started collaborating on projects that utilize all our different strengths. My sister's medical expertise has helped us develop workplace wellness programs. My younger brother's financial acumen has been invaluable for expansion planning. Mike and I have become genuine friends, not just siblings who tolerate each other at family events. He's pursuing his own entrepreneurial ventures now, inspired partly by watching me find success through unconventional approaches. We meet for coffee every few weeks to talk about business challenges and share ideas. The biggest change has been in how I see my own history. Those years of feeling like the family disappointment weren't wasted time, they were preparation period that I couldn't appreciate while I was living through it. Every failed project taught me something I needed to know. Every job I left provided skills I'd later use. Every risk that didn't pay off built resilience I'd eventually need. I still take creative risks, but now I do it within a framework that can sustain and build on both successes and failures. The difference is having a foundation solid enough to support experimentation and a team that benefits from innovation rather than suffering from instability. Last month, we celebrated Dad's 72nd birthday with another backyard party. This time, I was the one who gave a speech. I talked about the unexpected ways life can unfold, about the value of patience and perspective, and about how sometimes the people who believe in us see things we can't see in ourselves. But mostly, I talked about gratitude, for parents who loved me enough to let me find my own way, for siblings who supported me even when they didn't understand my choices, and for the strange journey that led me to exactly where I was supposed to be. The photographer captured different expressions this time. Instead of the humiliation and confusion from 2 years ago, the pictures show a family that has figured out how to appreciate each other's differences instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold. I keep Dad's folder of notes in my desk drawer now, not as evidence of manipulation but as a reminder that sometimes love looks like patient observation rather than immediate intervention. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is believe in your potential even when you can't see it yourself and wait for you to grow into the person they knew you could become. The company continues to evolve, and so do I. I've learned that success isn't about avoiding failure, it's about building something meaningful from all your experiences, both the ones that work out and the ones that don't. It's about finding the courage to be authentically yourself, even when that authenticity looks different from what everyone expects. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, it's about discovering that the people who matter most have been cheering for your authentic self all along, even when you couldn't hear them over the noise of your own insecurities and assumptions. 2 years ago, I thought I was the family disappointment. Today, I know I'm exactly who I was always meant to be.